Hello and welcome to Gin with Gwyn. I'm Oliver Gwyn, and this is where I give you my off-the-cuff and unrehearsed thoughts on marketing data and philosophy. This week, the unexamined life is not worth living. That's according to Socrates. We're going to be talking about the Socratic method and how it applies to business and decision making. Now, last year or maybe the year before, there was a bit of a viral trend where girlfriends were asking their boyfriends how often they thought about the Roman Empire, and seemingly every guy was thinking all the time about the Roman Empire. And that's not true of myself, but I do quite often think about ancient Greece because it's fascinating to me how much of modern day life goes back to a handful of philosophers back in ancient Greece. And Socrates is one of these people. He is known as the father of Western philosophy. And what perhaps makes it even more amazing is that he never wrote anything down. We only know about his way of thinking and his way of questioning because of his disciples, most noticeably Plato. Plato teaches Aristotle. Aristotle teaches Alexander the Great. Alexander the Great conquers the world. Eventually, the Romans take over his empire, and they spread this knowledge throughout the world. Of course, then we have a dark period in history after that, eventually leading to the Renaissance. So it's amazing to me how much goes back to ancient Greece and a handful of philosophers from there. Now, what is the Socratic method? I like to think of it as being like a toddler. You know, when you've got a toddler and they're like, hey, why is the sky grey? And then they say, okay, but why? But why? But why? But why? I like to think of it kind of like that. So Socrates liked to engage people in conversations, random people some of the time, and he tried to challenge their own beliefs by asking a series of questions to unpick the truth. And we don't have any direct examples of this, but what we do have is sort of made up scenarios where Plato has given us what kind of questions that Socrates would ask. So, for example, somebody might say that it is virtuous to love the god Zeus. And Socrates would then say, okay, but what does virtuous mean? And what does love mean? Because if we can't define what it is to be virtuous and we can't define what it is to love, then how can we know that we're loving Zeus? And how can we be certain that loving Zeus is virtuous? He would try and unpick people's own thoughts and challenge their own beliefs to not necessarily get to an answer, but to deepen their own understanding of their own thoughts. Used in teaching quite a lot to engage students and ask them their own things. They found that generally speaking, sometimes you need to unpick a personal relationship with a subject in order to get people to engage with it. Another method that it's used in is to break people up into groups. So modern day, you will ask people a certain question, and then some people answer it wrong, some people will answer it right. And if you put them in a group and ask them to discuss and debate it, they will all eventually come to the right answer normally. But how does that apply to business asking questions? Well, a few things. The first is we can think of it in terms of questioning norms so that businesses can disrupt industries. This has been a trend of the 2010s and onwards. People like Airbnb would ask the question, well, why do travelers need to stay in hotels? And of course, they built Airbnb. And most of these neobanks ask the question like, why do people physically need to go to a bank? Why are the banks closed after 5 p.m. when most people are still working? Socrates also asked us to force upon ourselves deeper reflections before taking action. So instead of trying to make a quick hire, leaders could instead ask, well, what qualities truly make a great team members? How can I ensure that this person will fit the role? And instead of asking things like, how can we get more sales? He challenged us to think about, okay, well, is more sales what we need? What type of sales do we need? What is the method that we're going to get those sales in? What is the sales journey? So his method was basically to ask a lot of different questions to try and unpick the truth. And I think this is something that is very useful in our modern day life. But I'm somebody who's surrounded by overthinkers. You know who you are if you're watching this. People do tend to have a tendency of overthinking, and then they get sort of paralysis by analysis, or their choice is too slow, or it's very much biased by whoever the last person they were speaking to. And so I kind of wanted to think, well, how do you balance the Socratic approach, the Socratic method, with also taking actions, because I think taking actions is the most important things in most situations. So a few examples of this might be setting a time limit for questions. So only giving yourself 15-30 minutes to ask Socratic questions and then make a decision. Instead of asking a million different things, try and ask what's the most important question that you can ask, which is not always easy, but that tends to be my approach to most problems, is what's the most important thing that will move the needle the most? What's the key questions that I can ask to come to an answer? The second thing would be to trust in experience and data. So if evidence or post-success supports a decision, then you can act without second guessing it every time. If 80% of customers want a new feature, there's no need to question it endlessly. You just go and implement it, right? Especially if you've then got a little bit of data about if those customers are high LTV customers. So instead of constantly having to ask yourself a million questions, just find something that gives you most of the answer quite quickly. The third thing would be having a decision threshold. So set a clear point when thinking stops and action begins. So if you have 70% of confidence, you'll move forward. I think today people are a little bit scared of making decisions without full confidence, without full data, but that's the world we're living in. It's always going to be the case. I don't believe we're ever going to get to a point where we'll know everything about everything all the time. These days, I worry that the decision-making process is to ask ChatGPT, but we'll come on to that. And last but not least, this thing that I believe in most wholeheartedly is iterating and adapting. So don't wait for that perfect answer. Take a small action, refine as you go. I think that's always the best action, because you never can accommodate all of the real life scenarios that you're going to come up to, even if you ask a load of questions, which is always useful and a good thing to do. You get to real life and the thing that you thought would change the world doesn't necessarily. It's only when you actually implement things that you get real data from that, and then you can act on that. Now, the world of business to me has changed quite a lot in my working life. And one of the key things that people are looking to do now is become more agile, act quicker, change their organization quicker. And the Socratic method can help in that, because it can help you to constantly challenge the norms that you're experiencing. It used to be the case that there was a stereotype, I would say, in the late 90s and the early 2000s, that new ways of working were rejected because people said, this is the way we've always done things, and they were stuck in their ways. And I think now companies are very aware of that trend and they're trying to get away from that. But the problem is that today's modern world seems to move a lot quicker than it used to, and we have a lot more fads. And those fads are not necessarily long-term things that you should reorganize your entire business around. They are quick things that happen almost quickly. And then as soon as you've sort of latched onto them, they're done. We see this mostly in culture. Squid Game was a huge cultural moment during the pandemic, and then very quickly it went away until it came back recently. Is anybody still thinking about Tiger King? Probably not. And those are the most common cultural touch points that we've had in today's fragmented society, where there's a million things going on. And so buying and consuming trends are even more fragmented from that. So what is a trend versus a fad? If we say a fad is a short temporary thing that you can't change your organization around, because changing an organization always takes time, and a trend is something that is long lasting, well, look for long lasting value. So trends generally provide a long-term value, while fads are flashy and they fade quickly. So you need to ask yourself the core question of, does this shift in your company align to your core mission and long-term goals? Because those things should not change depending on fads. Obviously use data, so separate fads from trends. Use customer feedback, purchasing patterns, market research to assess whether the shift you're seeing is temporary or more sustainable. Not always easy. Sometimes you miss some competitive advantage, but I also think that it's sometimes better to go second. That old phrase, it's always better to be second, because the first person goes and makes a lot of mistakes and you can learn from that. The same thing can happen if you rush to market with the wrong thing and it turns out that actually this is just a spur of the moment type of thing. And use customer feedback as a compass. If customers are generally asking for a new solution, if there's a clear demand behind it, it might be a longer term trend. So coming back to Socrates, I think the lesson that he teaches us in his approach is that we should constantly be questioning ourselves, the way that we're thinking, any biases that we might have. And we should try and unpick our relation to the subject and the problem at hand. And that can help us not necessarily come to a decision, but to understand our own thinking a lot clearer. We also need to balance that by making sure that we are making clear decisions quickly, and that that decision doesn't become analysis paralysis where it actually costs us money. But we need to simultaneously balance that with a need to separate out what is a short-term problem that is not long-term, and it's not necessarily aligned to our bigger aims and goals. Always worth mentioning that while Socrates was going around and he's revered today, he was sentenced to death for asking too many questions and for being kind of cheeky. They were sentencing him and found him guilty of influencing his disciples against the Athenian government. And he said, "You should throw a banquet in my honor and invite me there." And so they decided to kill him. So a word of warning, if you're that person that likes to ask a lot of questions, it can be very useful, but it's also maybe a little bit annoying. Although it could also be because Socrates famously didn't bathe a lot. Those have been my thoughts on decision making and Socrates this week. I hope you enjoyed this and tune in next week for some more Gin with Gwyn.